Good Wednesday afternoon, everybody. I'm meteorologist Tim Pandajis here with your tropical update. We're talking about Invest 91 and Tropical Depression 12. Both are candidates for our next two names on the list, and that's Julia and Carl. Today is Wednesday, October the 5th, 2022. So what has changed since we last spoke yesterday? Well, 92L, that was a tropical wave in the far eastern Atlantic, organized enough to warrant an upgrade to Tropical Depression number 12. And at this hour, it is barely holding on to Tropical Depression status as it's getting torn apart by some wind shear and overall hostile conditions in that part of the Atlantic. Now, development odds for 91L, that's the wave that's farther to the west or heading into the Caribbean as we speak. The development odds have been increased for that up to high odds, 80% chance within the next 5 days. Now, the long-term outlook on where 91L goes and tracks is going to be driven by some strong ridging that's signaled by our computer models to be slightly more amplified over the southern United States. And what that means is that storm track will be suppressed farther to the south and tracking west into likely Central America by later this weekend and into early next week. Good news for the U.S., not such great news for Central America that could possibly be dealing with a higher end hurricane making landfall there by the early part of next week. Now, before we dive into what's currently going on in the Atlantic Basin and with our waves and our tropical depression, I want to go back and talk about Ian. It's no longer named Ian. In fact, this is just the remnants of that storm that made landfall in Florida as a Category 4 last Wednesday. Its secondary landfall in South Carolina on Friday. The last advisory from the Hurricane Center issued on Saturday in Virginia, but here we are 4 days later, and it's still sitting off the Delmarva Peninsula along the east coast of the United States, bringing unsettled weather, some strong winds, and coastal flooding. Now, there doesn't look to be any threat of this redeveloping now that it is back over open waters. It's higher latitude, water's not as warm here, and we're not seeing much in the way of convection close to the center of those remnants there. So I think it's just interesting to see that it's still surviving despite being over land for so long and being so far to the north. It's been an ongoing thing that's been impacting the eastern seaboard. All right, here's what's currently going on in the basin. Tropical Depression 12, you can see it out here just to the west of the Cabo Verde Islands. The track on that, it's only around for the next 24 to 36 hours before it dissipates and just fades away into the Atlantic Basin. But we've got Invest 91L here that you can see the development odds are higher than when we spoke yesterday, up to 80% chance within the next 5 days. And that's important to note over the next 5 days because development will be slow to occur, much like what we saw when we were looking at 98L that went on to become Ian in the same exact location about 10, 11 days ago. So here's a look at it on satellite imagery. The latest stats coming from the Hurricane Center, 35-mile-an-hour winds. There's no close center of circulation. If there was, we'd likely have a tropical depression. It is moving rather quickly to the west at 18 miles per hour. Similar problem was presented to 98L that became Ian about 10, 11 days ago. Pressure is steady. 60% chance within 2 days. And you look at it here on satellite imagery, and it's like deja vu. 10, 11 days ago, satellite imagery looked almost identical to this. And when we compare tracks, the current location of 91L, the red line is Ian's track. And this is interesting because this is the third system so far this year that's been what we call a low rider. And what that means is it's developing at such a low latitude. There's the 10-degree north latitude there. It's currently located at 11.5 degrees north. We had Bonnie that failed to develop until it got into the far western Caribbean. We had Ian, which, of course, as we know, developed into a significant storm. And now we've got 91L here that's dealing with the same overall problems that 98L did, Ian, back when it was at this stage. Land interaction, northerly shear, and collapsing thunderstorm activity. Here's a look at it on visible satellite imagery. It doesn't look as put together as it was starting to look yesterday. Something I want to point out here is you see this line, this band of clouds that's racing out to the north and to the east of the center of 91L. That's what we call an outflow boundary. And what that is a symptom of collapsing thunderstorm activity. The downdrafts sink quickly, they hit the ocean surface and spread out in all directions. And that's evident right here, called the outflow boundary or gust front, racing out. That is not typically a signal that points to a system about to intensify. So that's why development will be slow to occur here. It's going to take probably a couple of days before it works its way into the Caribbean and out of some wind shear that's also being imparted on it from the north. Not particularly strong. If you remember when 98L was here, which went on to become Ian, there was strong northerly shear because it was the outflow from Hurricane Fiona that was racing up towards Nova Scotia. This is not the outflow from any tropical system, really. Well, I guess it could partly be from Ian that's off the coast of the East Coast. Some may be part of that, but overall some northerly winds aloft that's displacing a lot of the convection, and most of that convection is occurring now over land, which we also saw with 98L. Hurricane hunters have been out and surveying the storm so far. They found winds up and over tropical storm force, but again, we're lacking that closed center of circulation. They're staging out of the U.S. Virgin Islands and flying missions into this. They'll likely go out again later today to see if anything has changed. Overall, going forward, though, the conditions, the environmental setup is conducive for it to get its act together, albeit slowly to start, and then likely the potential of a big burst of intensification as it gets way out into the central and western Caribbean, where conditions are even better, in fact, ideal. Warm waters have never been a problem so far this season. Water temperatures north of 80 degrees, which is what you need for tropical development. Certainly here, we've got upper 80s, even some low 90s in spots. And it's not just the skin of the ocean that's very warm. We talked about this yesterday and in numerous previous videos. Ocean heat content basically is that warm water on the skin of the ocean, but also extending down to a depth. And the deeper it goes, the more ocean heat content is available. And the Caribbean, especially the Western Caribbean, is some of the highest ocean heat content in the entirety of the Atlantic Basin. Why that's important is because once storms really get their act together, they get strong, they're very volatile and they mix up the ocean. So that's something called upwelling. And what happens in that process is that cooler waters from a depth get mixed up to the surface. And if the warm water is only at the skin of the surface, you're mixing up cooler waters and eventually you deplete your energy source. When you're in an area of high ocean heat content like we're seeing here, upwelling just continuously replenishes warm water. So an endless energy and heat supply for intensifying storms, which is why we saw Ian undergo 2 to 3 periods of rapid intensification as it entered these areas, made its first landfall in Cuba, and then of course moved north of there, another period of rapid intensification before it impacted southwest Florida. Not saying that 91L will have a similar fate to that, but it's moving into the similar environmental conditions. All right, so where do we go from here? How are the computer models seeing things? So we've got that 60% chance of developing within 2 days, moderate chance, much greater chance of it being after 2 days, between 2 and 5 days, 80% chance, high risk there. Computer models here are very clustered together. Notice this, we're only going out a couple days here, very good agreement, model consensus, high confidence forecast here of it tracking west, maybe picking up a slight northerly component to it. Then going out 5 to 7 days from now, notice that the model consensus continues. With Ian or 98L, we had a large divergence the farther out we went. That's why the forecast was such low confidence on where it would go. There were so many variables in play here that was driving different outcomes from different models. Much better consensus here, meaning a much higher confidence forecast on whatever 91L develops into will likely be impacting Central America later this weekend into early next week. Now, why is there such high confidence and such good model agreement here? It has to do with the overall atmospheric steering in place likely at that time. Again, this is modeled, hasn't happened yet, but this is what the models think will play out that's driving that westerly, southerly suppressed track. By Sunday, we've got a big ridge of high pressure, a mountain of air setting up shop over the southeast parts of the United States. As we go into early next week, that high spreads out a little bit more, forming essentially a wall that's keeping the storm track suppressed to the south and guiding it off to the west. So that high pressure system should keep everything to the south and not an issue or a threat to the Gulf Coast states or the eastern seaboard. However, a higher threat for Central America during that time. Now I want to jump over to the GFS ensemble. You've heard us talk about the GFS, the American model, the long-range computer model. What this is the ensemble has 30 members. 30 times we run the GFS, tweaking the variable slightly to get a different outcome. Now, I stopped it going out here just about 36 hours because I want to show you something interesting. There are 30 members to this ensemble. A good chunk of them, in the short term, really drive this west and even southwest, interacting more so with the northern coast of Venezuela. Land interaction would keep this much weaker for longer. And then even more interesting past that is a lot of models lose it developing altogether. There's only about 10% of model members here, 3 out of 30, that keep it together long enough to make it across the Caribbean and into Central America. So the GFS, at least the ensembles, are not really on board with this developing at all. However, the operational GFS shows slightly a different story when we compare it with the European. So let's look at the GFS and the yellow lines. What you're looking at are the isobars, the lines of equal pressure. When they're tightly packed together, that's a tight gradient, meaning a stronger storm. Watch what happens here when compared with the European. That's in the red lines, the red isobars. Hardly any development over the next few days. We really have to wait until the weekend. That's in the central and western Caribbean, south of Jamaica. We're starting to see both models lock on to development at that point in time by Saturday, October the 8th. Then it moves into that very deep, warm water, high ocean heat content. Both models show it intensifying possibly significantly before heading towards Nicaragua or maybe even Honduras. There's the GFS, highly amplified storm. European still a strong storm, but similar location-wise and timing-wise as well. The differences start here. Watch the European. Moves inland, dissipates, gone. GFS holds it together, takes a northerly component, moves over parts of eastern Nicaragua and Honduras, and then makes a secondary attempt at moving over land near Belize and the Yucatan Peninsula. Will that happen? It's a possibility, but nothing is set in stone, and at that point in time, it's rather weak too. And then notice both models do not take it into the southern Bay of Campeche or the southern Gulf of Mexico, which is good news. That being said, and what we just looked at with all our different computer model spreads, the areas to really monitor the forecast, and likely we'll see impacts from 91L as it goes on to get a name, which will likely be Julia or Carl, is going to be Central America. So Nicaragua, Honduras, El Salvador, Belize, Guatemala, and portions of Mexico and the Yucatan Peninsula. Even though there are some outlying members here that take it on a northerly component, the consensus of the majority of models that have been quite consistent take it due west, in part mostly due to that area of high pressure that'll be parked over the southeast and spreading out in time. All right, let's talk about Tropical Depression 12 because, as I mentioned, it's barely holding on to life. 35-mile-an-hour winds. There's the center of it there. Wind shear blowing a lot of the convection off and dislocating it. It'll track and kind of slide its way to the northwest and then dissipate. Again, no threat to any land anytime soon. Before we go today, I do want to take a little progress report of the season and compare the Atlantic season to the Eastern Pacific. The Eastern Pacific has had a blockbuster season so far, nearly double the amount of named storms that we've seen in the Atlantic. But something I want to bring to your attention as I step off so you can see it is that both basins have produced 2 Category 4 hurricanes. The Atlantic did it with only 9 storms. The Pacific took 17. So keep that in mind. Although it was a slow start to the season, a lot of the storms we've seen in the Atlantic have been quite fierce. All right, that was a cross-basin comparison. How about a year-to-year comparison going back to 2017 up through yesterday? So we've had 9 named storms, 4 hurricanes, 2 went on to be major hurricanes, Fiona and Ian. Compared with years past, look where we were in 2020. Most active season on record. We finished up with 30 named storms. At this point, we were already at 24. 8 hurricanes, 2 majors. Back in 2017, which was really kind of the start of this era of very active seasons, we had 13 named storms, 8 hurricanes, and 5 of those were major up through this point in time in the season. Remember, there's just about 2 months left in the season, so about a third of the month still to go, third of the season still to go. All right, that's all I got for today. Until next time, you can find me on social media, Twitter, Instagram, and on Facebook. I'm also on TikTok at Tim Talk Weather. Hope you enjoy the rest of your Wednesday.